They say you can smell an empire dying. Not the clean scent of conquest. Not the sharp metal of swords or the smoke of victory pyres. No, a dying empire smells like desperation. Like flesh and stone burning together. Like cedar wood from demolished temples mixing with human hair. Like the end of everything familiar. In 146 BC, that smell hung over Carthage. For 17 days, the city burned. The flames were so bright, sailors claimed you could see them from 100 miles out at sea. The heat was so intense that stone cracked and marble melted. The screams carried on the wind until there were no more screams left to carry. And when it was finally over, when the last wall crumbled and the last citizen fell, a Roman general stood in the ruins and wept. He wept because he knew someday Rome would burn too. This is the story of how the greatest naval power the world had ever seen was erased from existence. How a rivalry that lasted over a century ended not in peace but in absolute annihilation. How Rome learned that to become an empire, you first had to become a monster. This is the fall of Carthage. And it begins not with fire, but with jealousy. Picture the Mediterranean in 264 BC. Two powers, two destinies. Two completely different visions of what greatness meant. Staring at each other across a sea that wasn't big enough for both of them. On one side, Rome. Young, hungry, disciplined. A land power built by farmers and soldiers who believed their gods had chosen them for greatness. They had conquered Italy through sheer stubbornness, through refusing to quit even when every rational calculation said they should. But they'd never built a navy, never needed to. The sea was someone else's kingdom. On the other side, Carthage. And Carthage? Carthage owned the waves. Let me tell you what Carthage actually was. Because history tends to show us Carthage only through Roman eyes, and Rome hated them. But before the hate, before the wars, Carthage was extraordinary. Founded by Phoenician refugees from the city of Tyre around 814 BC, Carthage started as a trading post, a place to resupply ships, repair sails, make deals. But it grew, and grew. Within centuries, it had become something no one expected. A commercial empire that touched 3 continents. Walk through Carthage in its golden age and you'd hear a dozen languages in the markets. Berber traders from the African interior selling ivory and gold. Iberian merchants offering silver and tin. Greek philosophers debating in the streets. Egyptian priests selling incense and papyrus. The city was a crossroads of the entire known world. Their harbor was an engineering marvel. 2 massive basins, one for merchant ships, one for war galleys. The military harbor was circular with an island command center in the middle. From that tower, admirals could see every ship at once. They could launch 200 warships in less than an hour. The Romans had never seen anything like it. Carthaginian ships carried purple dye so expensive that only kings could afford it. They traded in silk from the distant east, in Spanish silver, in British tin, in African elephants. Their coins were found from Gibraltar to the Black Sea. Their sailors knew routes most people thought were myths. Some historians believe they may have even reached the Americas centuries before anyone else. They were rich, unimaginably rich. But here's what made Carthage different from most ancient powers. They didn't rule through fear, they ruled through contract. Cities in their empire weren't conquered, they were partners, business partners. Carthage provided protection, trade access, and wealth. In return, those cities provided goods, soldiers when needed, and loyalty. It was empire as a business model, and it worked brilliantly. Their religion was complex, sometimes dark. They worshipped Baal Haman and Tanit, gods of sun and moon, fertility, and war. Yes, there's evidence they practiced child sacrifice in extreme circumstances, though Roman propagandists certainly exaggerated this. But they also valued learning, art, and innovation. Their libraries were famous. Their agricultural techniques were so advanced that after Carthage fell, the Romans saved only one thing: a 28-volume encyclopedia on farming written by a Carthaginian named Mago. This was the civilization Rome was about to fight. But here's the thing about empires built on commerce. They're pragmatic, flexible, They'll make deals, sign treaties, avoid unnecessary wars. Because war is expensive. War disrupts trade. Carthage didn't want to conquer the world. They just wanted to profit from it. Rome was different. Rome didn't compromise. Rome didn't share. Rome believed in absolutes, victory or death, domination or humiliation, empire or slavery. And when a small conflict erupted in Sicily, a dispute over mercenaries that should have been resolved with diplomacy, both powers saw something bigger. An opportunity, a test, a line in the sand. Sicily sat between them. Whoever controlled it controlled the central Mediterranean, controlled the trade routes, controlled everything. So they went to war. The First Punic War, 264 BC. It would last 23 years and it would change both civilizations forever. Rome had a problem. They were fighting the greatest naval power in the world, and they didn't have a navy. Think about that for a second. Imagine declaring war on a maritime empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for 400 years without any ships. It sounds insane. Suicidal even. But Rome did something that perfectly captured who they were as a people. They captured one Carthaginian warship that had run aground. Just one. A quinquerema, a massive galley with 5 banks of oars and a bronze ram on the prow. Carthaginian sailors had been using these for generations. They were works of art, engineering masterpieces. The Romans took it apart like a puzzle. Within 60 days, they'd reverse engineered it and built 100 copies. They cut down entire forests, mobilized every shipwright in Italy, trained crews on land, literally. They set up rowing benches on the beach and practiced the motions in the sand before ever touching water. Within a year, they had a fleet. But here's the problem. Building ships and sailing ships are two completely different things. Roman sailors had never seen open water. They didn't know how to navigate by stars, how to read currents, how to turn a quinquereme in combat without capsizing. Carthaginian sailors learned these skills from childhood. It was in their blood. So Roman engineers invented something new, the corvus, a boarding bridge about 36 feet long with a massive spike on the end. When enemy ships got close, you'd drop the bridge. The spike would slam into the enemy deck and lock the ships together. The logic was simple, almost childish. If we can't outsail them, we'll turn sea battles into land battles. We'll board their ships and fight them like we fight everyone else. Face to face, sword to sword, and it worked. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, Rome's untested navy met Carthage's professional fleet. The Carthaginian admiral couldn't believe what he was seeing. These farmers in boats, these amateurs with their crude boarding bridges, it would be a slaughter. It was. Just not the way he expected. Roman ships locked onto Carthaginian vessels like wolves. The corvus bridges slammed down with bone-shaking force. Roman soldiers poured across, not sailors, but legionaries. Battle-hardened infantry who'd spent their entire lives training for close combat. Suddenly, Carthage's finest sailors were fighting Roman legionaries on their own decks. In the cramped space of a ship's deck, there was no room for tactical brilliance. Just blood and iron. And in close combat, no one beat Rome. They sank 50 Carthaginian ships that day, captured 30 more. The Queen of the Seas had just lost to farmers who'd learned to swim. But Carthage didn't panic. They had money. They hired more mercenaries from across their empire. Numidian cavalry, Iberian swordsmen, Gallic warriors, Greek strategists. They built more ships, better ships, faster ships. They adjusted their tactics, avoiding close combat, using their superior seamanship to outmaneuver the clumsy Roman vessels. The war dragged on, year after year, battle after battle. The Mediterranean turned red with blood from both sides. Rome lost entire fleets to storms. In 285 BC, a massive tempest destroyed nearly 300 Roman ships off the coast of Sicily. Over 100,000 men drowned, the largest maritime disaster in history. Rome mourned for months, then they built a new fleet. Carthage poured fortunes into the war, millions in silver, entire treasuries emptied to keep armies in the field. Their merchant princes grew restless. The war was bleeding them dry, but neither side would quit. For 23 years, they tore each other apart, until finally, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, Rome's navy, now seasoned, now professional, decisively defeated Carthage's fleet. The Carthaginian government, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. The terms were brutal. Carthage would abandon Sicily entirely, pay 200 talents of silver, a fortune that would take decades to repay, reduce their navy to a defensive force, never again expand without Rome's permission, never again threaten Roman interests. They signed the treaty, they had no choice. In Rome, they celebrated triumph parades, temples dedicated to victory, songs about the war that would be sung for generations. But in Carthage, something else was happening, something darker. A humiliation settled into the bones of the city. The merchant princes swallowed their pride and spoke of peace and prosperity. The priests made sacrifices and prayed for better fortune. But in the heart of one Carthaginian family, a different kind of oath was being sworn. An oath that would shake Rome to its foundations. His name was Hamilcar Barca. Barca meant lightning, and he lived up to the name. General, war hero. The man who'd fought Rome to a standstill even as his own government abandoned him, even as the Senate in Carthage made peace while his army still stood undefeated in Sicily. Hamilcar didn't go home in triumph after the First Punic War. He went home in rage. He had a son, 9 years old, bright eyes, sharp mind, already learning tactics and strategy at his father's knee. Before leaving to rebuild Carthage's fortunes in Spain, Hamilcar took the boy to the temple of Baal Hammon. The sacred fires burned day and night there. The air was thick with incense and sacrifice. Hamilcar made his son place his small hand on the burning altar. Not enough to scar, but enough to hurt. Enough to remember. And there, in front of the gods and the flames, Hamilcar made his son swear an oath. I will never be a friend to Rome. The boy's name was Hannibal Barca, and that oath would nearly destroy the Roman world. For the next decade, Carthage licked its wounds and rebuilt. Not through Mediterranean trade, Rome controlled those waters now, but by conquering Spain. The silver mines of Iberia were among the richest in the world, and the Iberians themselves, fierce warriors, perfect soldiers. Hamilcar led the campaign, carving out a new Carthaginian empire in the west. When he died in battle, his son-in-law Hasdrubal took command and continued the work. And when he was assassinated, the army, 100,000 men strong, unanimously chose their next commander. Hannibal Barca, 26 years old, already a legend among his troops. He was brilliant, not just in tactics, but in understanding people. He spoke multiple languages: Phoenician, Greek, Latin, Celtic dialects. He ate with his soldiers, slept in their camps, shared their hardships. When his men were hungry, he was hungry. When they bled, he bled with them. And he looked at Rome, now comfortable, now confident, now thinking Carthage was broken. And he smiled, because Rome had made a mistake. They thought the First War was over. Hannibal knew it had only paused. In 218 BC, he did the impossible. He marched an army from Spain to Italy. Not by sea, Rome controlled the waters. Not through the obvious routes, Rome watched those. No, Hannibal chose a path so insane that Roman generals didn't bother defending it because they assumed no army could survive it. He crossed the Alps in late autumn. 37 war elephants, 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, wagons of supplies, siege equipment, everything an army needed to invade Italy. And he took them through mountain passes that even experienced travelers avoided. Picture this: thousands of men climbing narrow paths carved into cliff faces. One wrong step and you'd fall 1,000 feet. The air was so thin that soldiers gasped with every breath. Snow began falling in September, then October. Then the real storms hit. The elephants, African elephants, massive beasts that had never seen snow, panicked. Some fell off the paths, tumbling into chasms, their screams echoing for miles. Men froze to death in their sleep. Entire sections of the path collapsed under the weight of the army, sending hundreds plummeting to their deaths. Local Celtic tribes attacked them in the passes, rolling boulders down onto the columns. Hannibal's men fought battles at altitudes where the dead froze solid before they could be buried. For 15 days they climbed. For 15 days they died. When they finally emerged on the Italian side of the Alps, Hannibal had lost half his army. Of the 37 elephants, maybe a dozen survived. His men were exhausted, frostbitten, traumatized. But they were in Italy, and Rome had no idea they were coming. Hannibal gave his troops one speech. Simple, direct. "Everything you see before you," he said, gesturing to the fertile valleys of northern Italy, "belongs to Rome. Their wealth, their land, their people. I promised you we would take it all. Today we begin keeping that promise." And for 16 years, he kept it. The Roman legions came to stop him. Hannibal destroyed them at the Trebia River, luring them across freezing water into an ambush. 30,000 Romans dead. They came again. He ambushed them at Lake Trasimena, trapping 15,000 soldiers against the water and slaughtering them in 3 hours. The lake turned red. Literally red. For days afterward, locals reported the water tasted of blood. But the masterpiece of the battle that military academicians still study 2,000 years later was Cannae. August 216 BC. Rome sent everything. 8 full legions, 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. The largest army Rome had ever assembled. They were done playing games. They were going to crush Hannibal through sheer numbers. Hannibal had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. Half their numbers. He should have lost. Instead, he performed the perfect double envelopment. He positioned his weakest troops in the center, deliberately letting them fall back as the Romans pushed forward. The Roman army, seeing the center collapsing, surged ahead like a fist punching into a pillow. Then Hannibal's cavalry swept around both flanks. His African infantry closed in from the sides. Within an hour, 80,000 Romans were trapped in a shrinking circle, being crushed from all directions. It was slaughter on an industrial scale. 50,000 Romans died that day. Senators, consuls, knights, citizens, all packed so tightly they couldn't even raise their swords. They died standing up, pressed against each other, suffocating in the heat and blood. Hannibal sent a message back to Carthage. 3 bushels of gold rings, stripped from the fingers of dead Roman nobles and senators. A message written in metal. "I am here. I am winning. And there is nothing Rome can do to stop me." Rome panicked. Cities across Italy defected. Allies who'd been loyal for generations suddenly joined Hannibal. For the first time since its founding, Rome genuinely feared it might fall. But Hannibal made one critical mistake. He never directly attacked Rome itself. He waited for the city to collapse from within, for political infighting to tear it apart, for the weight of defeat to crush Roman morale. He understood military strategy perfectly, but he misunderstood Rome's spirit. Because Romans didn't surrender. Ever. After Cannae, when the Senate met to discuss what to do next, they didn't talk about peace terms. They talked about raising new legions. They banned public mourning because it hurt morale. They told the families of the dead, grieve in private and get back to work. While Hannibal was winning battles in Italy, Rome was playing a longer game. They sent a young general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, to attack Carthage's territories in Spain, cut off Hannibal's reinforcements, strangle his supply lines, recruit his Iberian allies. And it worked. For years, Hannibal won battles but couldn't win the war. His allies gradually drifted away. His supplies dwindled. His elephants died. His soldiers grew old fighting an enemy that refused to quit. Then in 204 BC, Scipio did something audacious. He invaded North Africa, landed an army on Carthaginian soil, threatened the city itself. Suddenly, Hannibal, undefeated in Italy for 16 years, the terror of Rome, the greatest general of his age, received orders from Carthage. Come home. Not as a conqueror, as a defender. In 200 BC, at a place called Zama, roughly 80 miles southwest of Carthage, Hannibal and Scipio finally met. It was the greatest tactical mind of the age against Rome's rising star. The two men actually talked before the battle, met on neutral ground, discussed peace terms. It was the only time in history these two titans spoke face to face. The talks failed. War it would be. The battle itself was brilliant and brutal. Hannibal tried his old tactics. Scipio, who'd studied every battle Hannibal ever fought, countered them all. When Hannibal sent his elephants charging, Scipio's troops opened lanes and let them pass through harmlessly. When Hannibal tried to envelop, Scipio's cavalry was faster. For once, Hannibal lost. Not just the battle, the war, everything. Carthage sued for peace, again. The terms were even more devastating than after the First Punic War. Massive reparations that would bankrupt the state. Complete disarmament, they had to burn their entire fleet except for 10 ships. Surrender all war elephants. Never ever go to war without Rome's explicit permission. Carthage was broken, humiliated, neutered, but still alive. And in hindsight, that was Rome's mistake. For 50 years, Carthage did everything right. Everything. They paid their war reparations early. Every installment on time, no complaints. They didn't build armies. They didn't even build fishing boats without asking Rome first. They focused entirely on peaceful trade, on agriculture, on slowly rebuilding their wealth through commerce. And they were good at it. Too good. By 150 BC, Carthage was thriving again. Not militarily, they couldn't by treaty. But economically, the city was booming. The markets were full. The harbors buzzed with merchant ships. The countryside produced grain and olive oil that fed half the Mediterranean. They became Rome's ally, officially. They sent grain shipments to Rome during famines. They honored every treaty. They bent the knee. They did everything a defeated power should do. And Rome hated them for it. In Rome's Senate, an old man rose to speak. His name was Cato the Elder. He'd fought in the Second Punic War as a young soldier. He'd seen what Hannibal did to Roman armies, and he couldn't let it go. Every single speech he gave, we have records of dozens, ended the same way. Didn't matter what the topic was. Taxes, roads, grain prices, aqueducts. Always the same ending. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He'd bring props to the Senate. Fresh figs, claiming they'd been picked in Carthage just 3 days ago. Look how close they are, he'd say, holding up the figs. Look how quickly their ships could reach our shores. Look how rich they've become. How long before they break the treaty? How long before another Hannibal rises? It was paranoia. It was propaganda. It was fear-mongering of the highest order. It was also effective. Because Rome had changed. The republic that once fought for survival was now fighting for dominance. The Senate wasn't filled with farmer soldiers anymore. It was men who just wanted to protect their land and go home. Now it was filled with career politicians, with generals who'd tasted conquest and wanted more, with businessmen who saw Carthage's trading wealth and wanted it for themselves. More importantly, a generation had grown up hearing stories about Hannibal, about Cannae, about the 16 years of terror. Those stories had become mythology. Carthage wasn't just an old enemy, it was the boogeyman, the thing that nearly destroyed Rome. And Carthage, rich, recovering, still existing, was an insult to Roman pride. Rome's younger politicians, ambitious men looking to make names for themselves, saw Carthage as an opportunity. Conquer it, and you'd be a hero. You'd have triumph parades, you'd have your name carved in marble. In 149 BC, Rome finally found its excuse. Carthage had a neighbor, the Numidian king Massinissa. For years he'd been nibbling at Carthaginian territory, taking a field here, a village there, and Carthage couldn't do anything about it because fighting back would violate their treaty with Rome. But after decades of this, Carthage finally snapped. They raised a small army and pushed back. Rome declared this a violation of the peace treaty. The Third Punic War began. But this wasn't a war. Not really. It was an execution. Rome sent both consuls, the two highest military commanders in the Republic, with 4 legions, not to conquer Carthage, to erase it. When the Roman armies arrived, Carthage panicked. The Senate sent ambassadors immediately, waving olive branches, begging for mercy. "We'll do anything," they said. "Name your terms." Rome's terms: surrender your weapons. Carthage did it. Everything. 200,000 swords and spears. 2,000 catapults. Every weapon in the city piled up on the beach and handed over to Roman soldiers. The Carthaginians stood there, disarmed, vulnerable, hoping this would be enough. Then Rome made its final demand. Abandon the city, every citizen. Move 10 miles inland, never return to the coast. You can rebuild there. For a civilization built on maritime trade, for a people whose entire identity was tied to the sea, this wasn't peace. This was death by another name. 10 miles inland with no ships, no harbors, no trade? Carthage wouldn't survive a decade. The Carthaginian ambassadors returned to the city in shock. They called an emergency assembly. Thousands gathered in the forum. When the Roman demands were read aloud, the crowd went silent. Then someone screamed. Then another. Then the entire city was screaming. They didn't scream in fear, they screamed in rage. For 50 years, they'd been obedient. For 50 years, they'd swallowed their pride, paid their tributes, followed every rule. And Rome's response was to demand their annihilation anyway. The Carthaginians made a decision that night. A collective decision made by bakers and merchants, by mothers and children, by old men who remembered the glory days and young people who'd only known peace. They refused. If Rome wanted Carthage dead, Rome would have to kill it. What happened next was extraordinary. The entire city transformed into a war machine. Overnight, they tore down temples to melt the bronze into weapons. Women cut their hair, all of it, to make bowstrings for bows. The beautiful cedars that lined the streets, cut down and carved into spear shafts. Leather from sandals and furniture became armor and shields. Enslaved people were promised freedom if they fought. Every man, woman strong enough to hold a weapon, everyone trained. The elderly melted down jewelry. Children ran messages. The entire population, like maybe 700,000 people in one, became an army. They worked day and night. Forges burned continuously. Within months, they'd recreated an arsenal from nothing. Rome laid siege. For 3 years, Carthage held out. 3 years of starvation, disease, death. They ate their horses, then their dogs, then leather, then anything. The Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of the Scipio who defeated Hannibal, couldn't believe it. He'd expected a quick victory. Instead, he was stuck outside the walls of a city that refused to die. He built a siege wall around Carthage, 23 miles long, completely encircling the city. No food in, no one out. Still, Carthage held. Roman soldiers could hear singing from inside the wall some nights. Defiant songs? Songs about Carthaginian glory. Songs that made the Roman troops uncomfortable, made them wonder what kind of people could sing while starving. Finally, in spring of 146 BC, the walls were breached. Not because Carthage gave up, but because there was simply nothing left. No food, no strength, no options. The Romans poured in, and then came the fire. 17 days. That's how long it took for Carthage to die. Let me describe what that actually meant. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus led his troops through the breached walls at dawn. The Carthaginians who could still fight met them in the streets. Not soldiers. Most of those had died months ago. These were shopkeepers with kitchen knives, grandfathers with makeshift spears, women throwing roof tiles from windows. The Romans didn't take prisoners. Street by street, building by building, they cleared the city. When defenders barricaded themselves in houses, the Romans set the houses on fire. When families hid in temples, the Romans burned the temples. The orders were clear: nothing survives. The city was built on hills, 7 of them actually, like Rome. As fires spread through the lower quarters, people fled upward. Thousands pressed into the citadel at the city's highest point, the Temple of Eshmun, Carthage's god of healing. For 6 days they held out there, no food, no water, surrounded by flames. They could see the entire city burning beneath them, their homes, their markets, their history turning to ash. On the 7th day, the Romans broke through. The final defenders, maybe 900 people, mostly women and children by then, had one last choice: surrender and be enslaved, or die free. The wife of the Carthaginian commander made the choice for them. Her name has been lost to history, but her final act hasn't. She took her 2 young sons by the hand, cursed the commander for his cowardice in surrendering, and walked into the burning temple. Others followed. Hundreds walked into the flames rather than become Roman slaves. The temple collapsed with them inside. Scipio watched from below. One of his officers later wrote that the general's face was unreadable. Just watching. Watching an entire civilization choose death over surrender. But the burning didn't stop with the citadel. It spread. It kept spreading. The harbor district went next. The magnificent circular harbor, the architectural wonder that Roman engineers had admired for decades, systematically destroyed. Every dock broken. Every ship dragged onto land and set ablaze. The warehouses full of grain, spices, and trade goods, all burned. The smell of cinnamon and frankincense mixed with burning flesh. The residential quarters burned for days. Carthaginian houses were built with cedar wood. Expensive, beautiful, and incredibly flammable. Entire neighborhoods went up like torches. The heat was so intense that soldiers had to retreat. Stone walls cracked from the temperature. Marble facades melted and ran like wax. The screaming never stopped. People trapped in collapsed buildings. People burning alive. People suffocating from smoke in cellars where they'd hidden. The sounds echoed through the ruins for more than a week. Roman soldiers looted everything that wasn't burning: gold, silver, art, furniture, anything of value. They found Carthage's famous libraries, rooms filled with scrolls and books, thousands of years of Phoenician knowledge, history, poetry, science. Most of it burned. Some was saved and sent to Rome's allies. Almost none survives today. An entire literary tradition gone. By the 10th day, there was nothing left to burn but bodies and rubble. But Rome wasn't done. Scipio ordered his engineers to demolish what the fire hadn't destroyed. The walls, massive fortifications that had protected Carthage for centuries, were torn down stone by stone. The foundations were dug up. The aqueducts were smashed. Even the sewers were filled in. And then came the salt. The famous story says Rome plowed salt into Carthage's earth, so nothing would ever grow there again. Modern historians debate whether this literally happened. Salt was expensive, and you'd need tons of it to actually poison that much land. But the symbolic gesture matters more than the literal act. Whether they actually used salt or not, Rome performed a ritual, a curse. They formally declared the site cursed ground. They prayed to their gods that anyone who tried to rebuild here would face divine wrath. It was spiritual annihilation on top of physical destruction. When the fires finally died, like 17 days after they'd begun, Carthage was gone. Not defeated, not conquered, gone. Scipio stood on the Byrsa hill, overlooking the ruins. His friend Polybius, the Greek historian, stood beside him. And Scipio did something unexpected. He wept. Not tears of joy. Tears of something else. Fear, maybe, or recognition. Polybius asked him why he was crying at the moment of his greatest victory. Scipio quoted Homer's Iliad, the passage where Hector foresees the fall of Troy. And then Scipio said something that Polybius recorded, something that echoes across history. I have a terrible feeling that someday, someone will give this same order about Rome. He was watching the future, watching his own city's fate written in Carthaginian smoke, because he understood something his fellow Romans didn't want to admit. Empires don't last, no matter how powerful, no matter how righteous they believe themselves to be. What you do to your enemies, eventually someone does to you. The survivors, maybe 50,000 from a city that once held $700,000, were rounded up and marched to the coast. Every single one was sold into slavery. Families were split apart, children taken from parents. Old people worked to death. The Carthaginian people scattered across the Mediterranean as property. But slavery wasn't the final insult. Rome banned the Carthaginian language, banned their religion, banned even the name Carthage from official documents. The city's history was rewritten from a Roman perspective, their achievements minimized, their culture dismissed as barbaric. They wanted to erase not just the city, but the memory of what Carthage had been. For nearly 2,000 years it worked. When people thought of Carthage, they thought only of Hannibal and the villain in Rome's story. They didn't think of the libraries or the harbors or the art or the culture. They thought of Rome's enemy, Rome's victim, Rome's warning to the world about what happens when you challenge an empire. But here's something most histories don't tell you. Carthage didn't completely disappear. Some Carthaginians escaped the siege before the final assault. Merchants who were abroad on trading missions, sailors on distant voyages, families who'd fled to allied cities, and they remembered. In North Africa, in Sicily, in Spain, in the small towns and villages that had once been part of Carthage's trading empire, the Punic language survived. Berber tribes who'd allied with Carthage kept Carthaginian traditions alive for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that Punic religious practices continued in North Africa until the arrival of Christianity 400 years later. The language itself survived even longer. Saint Augustine, writing in the 4th century AD, mentioned that in parts of North Africa, people still spoke Punic. That's 500 years after Rome burned Carthage. But there was no Carthaginian nation anymore. No Carthaginian identity, just scattered remnants. Ghosts of a civilization. Rome, meanwhile, did rebuild on the site of Carthage, about a century later. Julius Caesar and later Emperor Augustus founded Colonia Julia Carthago, a Roman city on Carthaginian bones. It became one of the richest cities in the Roman Empire, the capital of the province of Africa. Grain from Carthage